My brother didn't even look up when I walked into the room. He was already seated at the head of the conference table, jacket pressed, cufflinks catching the light, talking to the estate lawyer like the meeting had already started without me. Which, knowing Derek, was probably the plan. I was 29 years old. I had just driven 4 hours from Sudbury to Toronto in a February snowstorm. And I was 3 minutes late because I had stopped to help an elderly man whose wheelchair had gotten stuck in a gap between the sidewalk and the curb outside the building on Bay Street. His front wheel had wedged itself in at an angle, and no one walking past had stopped. People in suits just stepped around him like he was a planter. I crouched down, worked the wheel loose, and steadied the chair. He thanked me and asked if I was heading into the Lanthier building. I said yes, to the 17th floor. He smiled and said he was going to the same floor. I held the door and we rode the elevator up together. His name was Albert. He wore a navy wool coat that had seen better decades and a hearing aid in his left ear. He smelled like cedar and coffee. He told me the ramp around the side of the building had been iced over since Thursday and that the building management had done nothing about it. I told him that was unacceptable. He agreed. When the elevator opened, he thanked me again and turned left toward the frosted glass doors of the firm. I assumed he was there for a different meeting. I turned right to check in with the receptionist, and she walked me down to the boardroom where Derek and the lawyer were waiting. Derek saw me and checked his watch. He didn't say hello. He said, "You're late." I sat down across from him and set my bag on the table. "Road conditions," I said. The lawyer, a man named Gauthier who worked for the firm that had handled our father's estate, opened a folder and began summarizing the situation. Our father, Robert Marchetti, had passed 11 weeks earlier, following a long illness. He had owned a property in Oakville, a registered investment account, a small business account for the landscaping company he had run for 31 years, and a life insurance policy. Our mother had passed when I was 12, and Derek was 16. There were no other children, no surviving spouse, and according to the will drafted 8 years ago, the estate was to be divided equally between Derek and me. It should have been simple. It was not simple. What Gauthier began explaining, with the careful language of someone who had practiced the phrasing in advance, was that, in the 14 months before our father's death, Derek had been granted power of attorney over his affairs as his health declined. And in that time, certain changes had been made. I kept my hands flat on the table and listened. The business account had been drawn down significantly. Our father's truck and equipment, which I had assumed would be liquidated as part of the estate, had already been sold privately. The proceeds had not been deposited into the estate. The Oakville property had been refinanced, and there was now a line of credit against it, with a balance of $240,000. I said, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that last part?" Gauthier repeated it. I looked at Derek. He was looking at his phone. I said, "When was that line of credit opened?" Gauthier said it had been opened 14 months ago, 1 month after Derek received power of attorney. Derek set his phone down and said, "Dad needed the money for his care. His extended health had run out. The private nursing cost was significant, and I covered it." I said, "Dad was living at home. I came every second weekend from Sudbury to help with his care. The LHIN coordinator arranged the home support visits." "What private nursing?" Derek said, "You weren't here, Mara. You don't know what it cost. Here is what I know about my brother. He is 4 years older than me and has, for as long as I can remember, operated under the assumption that being the eldest meant being automatically correct. He managed the books for his wife's family business before they divorced. He has expensive taste and a habit of explaining things to me in a slow, patient voice that I have spent my entire adult life resisting the urge to respond to with something I would regret. What I also know, because our father told me, sitting in the recliner in his living room in October when he could still hold a conversation, is that he had not wanted to give Derek power of attorney. He had been afraid to say no. Derek had come to him when he was having a difficult week, when the pain was high and the medication was making him confused, and he had put a document in front of him and told him it was just a precaution, just paperwork, just in case. Our father had signed it because he was tired and he trusted his son. He told me this, and then he told me he was sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. Then I drove back to Sudbury, and I started making notes. By the time our father passed in November, I had 3 months of notes in a document on my laptop. But notes were not evidence. And I had gone into that meeting in February believing that the most I could do was raise questions and hope that Gauthier would follow up. What I had not expected was what happened next. Gauthier finished his summary and opened his hands on the table in the way that lawyers do when they are presenting a situation that they find professionally uncomfortable. He said that before we proceeded to any distribution, There were some matters that the firm needed to flag. He said he had been reviewing the account records in preparation for this meeting and had identified several transactions that required clarification. Derek said, "What kind of clarification?" Gautier said that a series of transfers had been made from the estate's checking account to a numbered company registered in Ontario. The transfers totaled just over $68,000 across a 9-month period. He said the numbered company, when he had searched the registry, had one director. Derek said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Gautier slid a printed page across the table. He said the director of the numbered company was Derek Robert Marchetti. The room was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell you what my brother's face did, because I had never seen it do this before." Derek has always been composed. He has a kind of smooth confidence that I used to mistake for competence. But when Gautier slid that page across the table, something passed over my brother's face so fast that if I hadn't been watching for it, I would have missed it. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced immediately by the composed look I knew. But I saw it. I saw it. He said, "Those transfers were for estate expenses. There was a management agreement in place." I said, "Can we see the management agreement?" Derek said, "I'd like a moment to speak with my own counsel before we continue." Gautier said, "Of course." We recessed. Derek stepped out with his phone pressed to his ear. I stayed in the boardroom and thought about a Thursday in January, 3 weeks after our father's funeral, when I had driven down to Oakville to begin sorting through his house. Derek had arranged for a clearance crew to come the following weekend. He said he would handle the valuables, that he would have them appraised. I went to the house on Thursday partly because I wanted time alone in my father's space before strangers moved through it. I walked through his kitchen and his bedroom and stood in his garage for a long time looking at the shelves of things he had kept because he might need them someday. The little jars of screws sorted by size. The rubber mallet he had used to teach me how to set fence posts when I was 11. I went through his desk in the small room off the kitchen that he called his office. Most of it was straightforward. Old tax returns. The folder he kept his vehicle documents in. A plastic sleeve of receipts he had saved for reasons I couldn't determine. At the back of the bottom drawer, under a Manitoba road map from 2003, I found a USB drive. It was a small blue drive, the kind that comes free with a conference registration package. It had a piece of masking tape on it with my father's handwriting. The tape said, "Mara." My father was not a digital person. He did not own a laptop. He had an old desktop computer in that room that he used to check email and print off coupons. The desktop was already gone. Derek had taken it the week after the funeral, said he was wiping it before donating it. But he had left the USB drive in the drawer, with my name on it. I put it in my coat pocket and I didn't say anything to anyone. When I got back to Sudbury, I sat at my kitchen table and plugged the drive into my laptop, and I did not breathe properly for the next 2 hours. My father had saved 3 things on that drive. A scanned copy of his original will from 8 years ago, the one that divided the estate equally between Derek and me. A folder of photographs. I understood immediately that these were documentation photographs, taken deliberately, showing the state of the house, the vehicles, the equipment with dates in the file names, and a text document that he had titled, in his careful way, "Things I Remember." It was 4 pages long. It was dated October, written in the weeks after the conversation we had in his living room. His spelling was imperfect and his sentences ran long, but it was clear and it was specific. He wrote about the afternoon Derek had come with the power of attorney document. He wrote about the phone call he had overheard Derek making from the kitchen, a call Derek didn't know he could hear, in which Derek said the words, "the business account," and "once the paperwork clears." He wrote about asking Derek about the refinancing and being told it was just a rate adjustment, a routine thing, nothing to worry about. He wrote that he had not believed Derek, but that he did not know what to do, and that he was writing this down so that someone would know. He wrote, near the end, "I should have trusted Mara more. She would have known what to do. She always knows what to do." I sat at my kitchen table and I cried for a long time. Then I called a lawyer. By the time I walked into that boardroom in February, I had already filed a complaint with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. I had already submitted the USB drive and its contents to my lawyer. I had already provided the transaction records I had obtained through my own account. I had been a co-signer on my father's personal checking account since his illness began, something Derek had apparently overlooked, and cross-referenced them against the timeline in my father's document. What I had not yet done was tell Derek any of this. Gautier called us back in after 20 minutes. Derek returned to the table looking composed again. He said he had spoken with his counsel and that he was prepared to provide documentation of the management agreement and all relevant expenses, and that he was confident the matter would be resolved. Gauthier said that before they proceeded, he needed to introduce someone who had joined the meeting. The frosted glass door at the far end of the boardroom opened. Albert came in with his wheelchair and his navy coat and his hearing aid. Behind him was a woman in her 40s carrying a leather binder. Derek looked at Albert the way he had looked at me in the elevator lobby. With a kind of dismissive scan, the assessment of someone who has already filed the person in question under irrelevant. He said to Gauthier, "Who is this?" Gauthier said, "This is Albert Renault. He's here at the invitation of the estate's secondary counsel." The woman with the binder introduced herself. She was a trust litigator. She had been retained by me, through my lawyer in Sudbury, to attend this meeting and to provide oversight of the estate proceedings. Derek said, "This wasn't disclosed." She said, "It was disclosed to the firm on Monday. You were copied on the communication." Derek said he hadn't seen it. His voice had a new quality, a slight thinness. Albert settled his wheelchair at the corner of the table and opened his coat. Underneath, he was wearing a suit. Not a flashy suit, a well-worn charcoal suit, the kind that has been pressed many hundreds of times. He took a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. The litigator set her binder on the table and said that in addition to her own involvement, Mr. Renault had agreed to provide a statement to the proceedings. She said that Mr. Renault was a retired partner of a downtown Toronto firm where he had practiced estate and trust law for 34 years, and that he had previously served on the Ontario Bar Association's estate law subsection, including 2 terms as its chair. Derek looked at Albert. Albert looked at Derek. Derek said, "I don't understand why a retired lawyer is relevant to this meeting." Albert said, in the mild and unhurried way I had already noticed about him, that he had reviewed the transaction records and the power of attorney documentation provided to him by the litigator over the preceding week, and that it was his professional view that the transfers to the numbered company did not constitute legitimate estate management expenses, and that several of the transactions bore characteristics consistent with a breach of fiduciary duty. He said he had taken the liberty of preparing a brief summary. The litigator handed copies to Gauthier and to Derek. Derek did not open his copy. Albert said, "You'll want to look at page 3. That's the line of credit. The draw schedule doesn't correspond to any documented care expense. It corresponds quite precisely to the repayment schedule on a business loan your numbered company had outstanding as of 14 months ago." The room was extremely quiet. I had known this from my lawyer's analysis, but hearing it stated aloud, in that room, in that mild and unhurried voice, was a different thing entirely. Derek said, "I want to adjourn this meeting." The litigator said that was his right, but that he should be aware that the OPGT complaint was already filed and under review, and that an adjournment would not affect that process. Derek said, "What OPGT complaint?" I said, "The one I filed in January." This was the moment. I had replayed it many times since, trying to find the word for what crossed my brother's face. It was not the quick flash I had seen earlier. This was slower. It was the look of someone who has been absolutely certain, for a very long time, that the person across the table was not a threat, and then understanding, fully and finally, that they were wrong. He said, "Mara." I said, "I found the USB drive, Derek, the one Dad left in his desk, with my name on it." He said nothing. I said, "He wrote everything down. The afternoon you came with the paperwork, the phone call he overheard, all of it. What had happened to our father's estate was not, in the end, a complicated scheme. Complicated schemes require maintenance, and they draw attention. What Derek had done was simpler and uglier than that. He had used a period of family grief and our father's declining capacity to move money in ways he believed would not be examined. He had done it with the confidence of someone who had always been the one holding the paperwork, who had always been the one managing things, who had always expected that I would not be paying close enough attention. He had not accounted for the fact that our father had been paying attention, right up until he couldn't anymore, and that he had found a way, in his careful and imperfect way, to make sure I knew. The OPGT investigation concluded in April. Derek's power of attorney was found to have been exercised in breach of his fiduciary duty. The transfers to the numbered company were clawed back into the estate. The line of credit, which had been fraudulently drawn down for purposes unrelated to our father's care, became Derek's personal liability. His numbered company was already insolvent. I was informed by my litigator that Derek was facing potential civil action and that the matter had been referred to the appropriate authorities for review of possible criminal charges related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable person under the criminal code. The process, she told me, would take time. These things always do. The Oakville property, once the line of credit liability was resolved, was part of what came back to the estate. It was sold in June. The proceeds, combined with the clawed-back transfers and the remaining registered investment assets, were distributed according to the original will. My half went into an account I opened with a credit union in Sudbury. The first thing I did was set aside an amount for a small ceremony, not a funeral. We had already had that, but a private thing, just me. At the conservation area where my father used to take us fishing when we were small, I brought the things I had kept from his desk. The little jar of sorted screws, the rubber mallet. I stood at the edge of the water for a long time. I had not talked to Derek since February. I did not expect to. There are people who do terrible things from a place of desperation, and I can find some way to hold that, to try to understand it. And then there are people who do terrible things from a place of entitlement, from the deep-seated belief that they deserve more than they were given, that the rules that apply to everyone else are a kind of inconvenience designed for people with less imagination. I know which one my brother is. What I think about, more than Derek, is my father in that small room off his kitchen, at his old desktop, writing 4 pages with his careful, imperfect spelling, with the knowledge that his time was limited, and that there was something he needed to make right. He could not undo what he had already allowed, but he could leave a record. He could put my name on a small blue USB drive and put it under a Manitoba road map in the bottom drawer of his desk and trust that I would find it. He trusted me, even at the end, when he was tired and in pain and had already made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. He found a way to trust me. Albert, I later found out, had been coming to that building for a meeting of a different kind, a quarterly gathering of a small group of retired barristers who met for lunch in one of the smaller boardrooms on the 17th floor. When the litigator had reached out to him for a statement, he had mentioned his meeting was in the same building. She had asked if he would be willing to attend in person. He had said yes, without hesitation. When it was over and we were in the elevator going down, Albert and I, he said, "Your father sounds like he was a careful man." I said, He was. He was very careful." Albert said, "The ramp is probably still icy." I said I would make sure to report it to building management on the way out. He said, "Good. Someone should." The elevator opened. We went our separate ways on Bay Street. It was still February. The sky was the particular gray that Toronto gets in winter, flat and close, and the wind off the lake cut right through everything. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment before I walked to my car. I thought about my father writing those 4 pages. I thought about him labeling that drive with my name, in his handwriting, with a piece of masking tape, and placing it under the road map where he knew I would eventually look because he knew I always looked through everything carefully, that I had been like that since I was small, that I never threw anything out without checking it first. He knew me. Even at the end, he knew exactly who to trust. I walked to my car and I drove home to Sudbury in the dark.